Story 1. The Indus Valley people who loved perfectly measured bricks. You are standing, or at least imagining yourself standing, in the warm, dusty heat of what is now Pakistan, some 4,000 years ago. The ground beneath you is not wilderness, nor a chaotic sprawl of huts and paths like you might find in other ancient towns. Instead, the streets here run straight as a ruler, crossing each other at perfect right angles, forming a grid so precise you could measure it with your eyes alone. The bricks beneath your feet are uniform, every single one of them, from the smallest in the alleys to the largest in the public buildings. Measures in the same ratio, length twice its width, thickness exactly half its width. Someone, or perhaps many someones, decided that this was how bricks should be made, and then they made sure everyone followed the rule. And they did this not for a single building, but for the entire city. You are in Harapuro, maybe Mohenjo-daro, one of the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization. The names are modern inventions, because no one alive today knows what these people called themselves, their cities, or even their land. No ancient inscription has ever given us their own words for their world. Their script remains undeciphered, leaving us with silent seals and carved symbols, each like a locked door without a key. Yet, in the silence, there is order. You walk down a main street wide enough for two carts to pass each other without forcing the drivers to exchange angry glances. The road is paved in baked brick, with slightly raised edges where shallow drains run straight, covered and aligned to flow downhill toward the edges of the city. The drains have removable brick covers, so that if a blockage occurred, someone could lift a section and clear it. Even waste management here was built for maintenance, for the slow and constant work of keeping a city running. It is a city without kings, at least, without the kind of kings we know from Egypt or Mesopotamia. There are no monumental statues of rulers, no palaces larger than the largest houses, no relief carvings of conquests or victories. The largest building might be a granary, or a public bath structures meant for everyone rather than for a single person. You notice this absence slowly, because in so many other ancient places, the landscape shouts the names and faces of the powerful. Here, it is as if the city itself is the monument. The people you passive, you imagine them, here are dressed in simple cotton cloth. They trade in beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli, and in small, square seals carved with animals, both real and possibly imagined, humped bulls, elephants, tigers, and a strange, horned figure seated cross-legged. Some seals carry short inscriptions, symbols repeated often enough to suggest meaning, but never yet understood. These seals are small, fitting in the palm of a hand, perhaps used to stamp wet clay on goods or documents. An official mark in a world without surviving paperwork. In the midday heat, you might wander into the great bath at Mohenjo-daro, massive, sunken rectangle of baked brick, lined with bitumen to make it watertight. Stairs descend from both ends, and a ledge runs around the inside. It is not for swimming, but perhaps for ritual bathing, or civic gatherings, or something we cannot quite guess. The air here would smell faintly of baked earth, water, and the faint sweetness of drying cotton. The houses themselves are built not only with uniform bricks, but with a kind of practical elegance. Many have 2 stories, with stairs rising in corners and windows facing inward to small courtyards. Wells are common even private homes often have their own, and some are shared among clusters of houses. In places where water must be drawn up, there are chutes and covered openings, so that the water, once lifted, could be poured into channels leading directly into kitchens or washing areas. This is not a city of haphazard growth. It is a city of deliberate choices, of a population that agreed somehow, without kings or obvious armies, on how things should be built and maintained. You cannot help but wonder, how does a civilization achieve such uniformity without force? Was it trade, shared belief, a deeply ingrained tradition? You step into the shade of a narrow side street. Here, the sounds of the main avenues fade. Somewhere, a potter's wheel hums softly, turned by practiced hands. Elsewhere, the faint clink of beads being strung reaches your ears. The air is dry, carrying the scent of baked brick and a faint, earthy aroma from the drains. Not unpleasant, but constant. What you do not hear is the shouting of orders or the clanging of weapons. If there is an army, it leaves little trace here. If there is a ruler, their power is invisible in the architecture. Instead, the city feels like a machine built for daily life, where the rhythm of fetching water, firing pottery, and measuring grain is the real engine of civilization. Even the city's layout hints at an underlying mathematics. Distances between wells, widths of streets, and the proportions of courtyards all seem to follow patterns. Was this knowledge recorded in books now lost, or simply passed down through generations of builders who knew the right way to measure? And as you walk toward the city's edge, where the fields begin, you see that the grid continues beyond the walls. Irrigation channels, as straight as the streets, draw water from the river into the farmland. In the distance, oxen pull plows, their steady pace as much a part of the city's life as the market stalls and bead makers within the walls. It is tempting to imagine that such order and cleanliness meant a peaceful life, but history rarely works that way. The river that gives life here can also take it away. Floods reshape the land, shift the river's course, and sometimes destroy what people have built. Beyond the horizon, other civilizations rise, trade, and perhaps compete with the people. Here, but that is for later. For now, in this first walk through the city, you have seen no battle, no grand proclamation, no carved stone king. You have only seen bricks, thousands upon thousands of them, all the same, all fitting together, and you are left to wonder, in a world where every brick is the same size, what kind of mind decided the size to begin with, and why did everyone agree? You have walked the streets and seen the bricks. Now you begin to notice something else. Small, flat squares of stone or terracotta, carved with images and a line or two of symbols. The images might show an animal, a human figure, or a strange, horned being with its feet tucked under in a meditative pose. Beneath each image, there are markstini, consistent and deliberate. This is the Indus script. It appears on seals, on small tablets, and occasionally on pottery shards or tools. Each inscription is short, often just 4 or 5 symbols. Unlike the sprawling cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs of Egypt, this writing never extends into long texts or visible narratives. It is almost as if these symbols were not meant to tell stories, but to mark ownership, identity, or perhaps even a religious invocation. And here is the problem. No one has ever read them. Without a bilingual key, like the Rosetta Stone, the Indus script has resisted every attempt to decipher it. We do not know the sounds behind the symbols, the language they spoke, or even whether the writing was purely phonetic or partly pictorial. This silence stretches across thousands of years, separating us from their voices, forcing us to piece together their lives from bricks, bones, and beads. But silence does not mean isolation. The Indus people were not cut off from the rest of the world. You find their beads tiny, polished carnelian cylinders buried in Mesopotamian cities hundreds of miles away. You see their seals in the ruins of far-off ports, suggesting they sailed or traded overland with distant cultures. In exchange, they brought home silver from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from what is now northern Pakistan, and possibly tin from as far as Central Asia. Imagine the slow, patient rhythm of that trade. A caravan might take weeks, even months, to cross the dry plains and mountain passes. Pack animals carried goods along routes older than any map, stopping at river crossings, caravanserais, and small trading towns. In the ports along the Arabian Sea, boats with square sails waited for the right wind to carry them toward the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates, or south toward the Persian Gulf. The goods themselves were not extravagant luxuries in the modern sense. Many were practical: cotton cloth, grain, dried fish, and timber. Others, like the beads, the carved seals, and perhaps even perfumed oils, were objects of beauty and status. A merchant might send out a crate of beadwork and return with blocks of copper, or jars of oil sealed with the image of a Mesopotamian bull. Back in the city, the merchants were not a separate, untouchable elite. The absence of grand palaces and royal tombs suggests that wealth here was more evenly distributed than in other ancient civilizations. A wealthy merchant's house might be larger or have better access to a well, but it still followed the same brick proportions, the same street plan. In the archaeological record, the sameness of house sizes is striking. It is as if the city's builders valued order over display, shared standards over personal grandeur. The streets, too, carried that same sense of quiet discipline. Wastewater flowed into covered drains that connected to larger channels under the main roads, which in turn led to soak pits or larger outflows at the city's edge. Public wells were spaced so that no home was far from clean water. The level of civic planning here was centuries ahead of what much of the world would achieve again. Daily life would have been filled with small, unhurried routines. Farmers tended barley, wheat, peas, and sesame in fields nourished by irrigation. Channels, in some areas, they may have grown cotton, the earliest known cultivation of the plant in the world. Cattle, water, buffalo, goats, and sheep grazed in the outskirts, providing milk, meat, hides, and labor. Inside the city, potters worked at their wheels. Beadmakers drilled tiny holes in semi-precious stones with astonishing precision, and carpenters shaped tools, carts, and furniture from the wood brought in from nearby forests. The air might carry the faint grit of stone dust from carving, the smell of wet clay drying, or the warmth of a hearth where bread baked slowly in clay ovens. And somewhere, perhaps in a shaded courtyard, scribes or whatever their equivalent was-pressed seals into clay. We call them scribes because they handled symbols, but we cannot say for sure whether they were recording language or simply repeating conventional marks of identity. Each seal carried not just its owner's sign, but a piece of an unbroken system, a tradition that stretched across the entire civilization. The reach of that tradition is astonishing. The uniformity of the bricks, the city layouts, the drainage systems, and even the seal designs extended across a territory larger than ancient Egypt or Sumer. From Harappa in the north to Dolavira in the south, from Mohenjo-Daro in the west to Rakhigarhi in the east. The civilizations, cities, shared the same planning logic. And here lies one of the great mysteries. How did they maintain such unity without a central ruler we can identify? In Egypt, A single pharaoh's image and name appears everywhere. In Mesopotamia, kings left inscriptions boasting of their conquests. In the Indus Valley, we find none of this. The power, if it existed, did not leave its mark in statues or royal tombs. Some scholars think this suggests a collective governance, perhaps a council of elders, or a network of local leaders bound by trade agreements and shared customs. Yet the order was not unchanging. Archaeological evidence shows that over time, the quality of construction in some cities declined. Bricks were reused rather than freshly fired. Drains were left unrepaired. Some wells went dry. In certain areas, houses were built over streets, suggesting a breakdown in the original planning. The reasons for this slow unraveling remain debated. Climate change may have played a role. The rivers feeding the civilization's fertile plains may have shifted or dried. Trade routes could have changed, cutting off the steady flow of goods. Internal pressures, disease, political fragmentation, or resource depletion might have weakened the cities. And here we pause, looking at a civilization that could measure bricks so perfectly, plan streets so neatly, and trade so widely, yet leave behind no kings, no clear religion, number decipherable records. It raises a quiet question, one that echoes down the millennia. Is it possible for a great civilization to thrive without rulers we can name, without monuments to individuals, without the noise of conquest? You walk again through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, but the air feels different. The bricks are still here, but some are chipped at the corners, their edges rounded by time. Along the drains that once ran straight and clean, you see missing covers, with debris caught in the channels below. Where the avenues once cut through the city in neat lines, new walls now jut into the roadway, narrowing the space. In places, houses press closer together, blocking what had once been open passageways. The order that once defined the city is beginning to loosen. It is not the destruction of a great battle. There is no smell of ash, no layers of charred ruin, no toppled monuments of kings. Instead, there is the quiet erosion that comes when people begin to let things slide. It is the kind of decline that is hard to notice when you live through it day by day. A cracked brick left unrepaired, a drain left half-blocked, a field left unplanted because the river water didn't reach it that year. Over time, the small lapses add up, and the city begins to change. The rivers that sustained these cities were never fixed in place. The Indus and its many tributaries have always been restless, shifting their courses over decades. A channel that once fed an irrigation system might slowly silt up, leaving farmland dry. A flood might sweep away embankments and deposit heavy layers of mud where crops once grew. Even a slight shift could force farmers to move their fields or abandon a settlement entirely. When a city depends on those fields for its grain, a change in the river's mood can mean the difference between surplus and scarcity. In the later years, the precision of the Indus Valley's craftwork begins to fade. The beads are not drilled, as finely the pottery loses its sharp symmetrical shapes. Even the once standardized bricks begin to vary in size. These changes might seem small, but they hint at something larger. A disruption in the networks that once brought the finest materials and kept artisans busy. Without steady supplies of quality stone, metals, and dyes from far-off lands, the work could not be as refined. And without surplus goods to sell, merchants had fewer reasons to travel and fewer treasures to bring home, far beyond these cities. In the ports of Mesopotamia, the carved seals of the Indus become rare. Where once they had marked bales of cotton and jars of oil bound for foreign markets, now they appear only occasionally. The steady flow of goods across the Arabian Sea has slowed. Perhaps other trade routes have taken their place, or perhaps the merchants themselves have turned inward, trading more with nearby towns and less with the far-off lands that once knew their name. Life in the city still goes on, but more quietly. The granaries that once held the harvest from the surrounding countryside may not be as full. The great bath, where water once glistened on sunlit mornings, might stand dry if the bitumen lining cracked and no one took the time to repair it. In the houses, cooking fires still burn and cotton still hangs in doorways to dry, but the city as a whole feels smaller. It is not abandoned, not yet, but it is less than it was. Some people may have chosen to leave, seeking better land where the water still runs clear and the soil is still rich. Others might have moved closer to the remaining trade routes, following the flow of goods instead of rivers. Over time, whole neighborhoods could empty as families left, the sound of daily life replaced by the whisper of wind against brick walls. What is striking is the absence of a final moment. There is no single day when the Indus Valley civilization falls. No invading army leaves its mark here. No one writes the last words in the last record. Instead, the cities simply fade. A well runs dry, and people stop using it. A street becomes impassable, and no one clears it. A granary is left empty for a season, then for good. Bit by bit, the grid is abandoned. Centuries later, when the bricks are rediscovered under layers of earth, they are still aligned in their careful proportions, even if many have fallen. The wells are still there, though filled with silt. The drains still run in straight lines under the dust. All of it feels as if the builders have just stepped away for a moment and might return. Yet they never do. And here is the question that lingers. Did the people who lived in those final years understand that something was ending? Or did it happen so slowly that no one ever spoke of it, no one ever marked the turning point? Perhaps a child born in the last generation still thought the city was whole, even if a neighbor's house had collapsed and the bath was dry. Perhaps they believed life would go on just as it always had, until one day it didn't. We look at their ruins and see the perfection of the early years and the quiet unraveling of the later ones. But we cannot hear their voices. We cannot read their words. Their script remains silent, their history without names. And yet, through bricks and streets and the careful traces of water channels, they tell us something. They show us that a great civilization does not need towering statues or thrones to be remarkable. It can rise, flourish, and fade with barely a sound. And maybe that is the strangest part of all, that something so vast could disappear not with a crash, but with a long, measured exhale, until the only thing left is the pattern of the streets and the memory of perfectly measured bricks. Story 2. The Nukt culture's terracotta faces in the dust of Nigeria. You are standing in the north-central highlands of what is now Nigeria, in a place where the soil runs deep red and the air is heavy with the heat of the savannah. It is the early 1st millennium BCE, though time here is not marked by carved calendars or written chronicles. The people of this land will not leave behind a script for archaeologists to puzzle over. Instead, they will leave something more immediate faces. They are not flesh and blood anymore. They are clay, shaped and fired until they are hard as stone, and buried in the earth until chance brings them to light again. The first one you see has wide almond-shaped eyes cut through completely, like windows to emptiness. The nostrils are drilled through, and the mouth opens in a small oval, as if caught mid. There is a dignity in the features, but also a strange stillness. The Nok terracotta sculptures, as they will come to be called, are among the oldest known figurative artworks in sub-Saharan Africa. They appear in pieces heads, broken from bodies, torsos without arms, fragments of elaborate hair or beaded necklaces. Some are barely larger than your hand, others nearly like, and all of them seem to have been made with a precision and a patience that speaks to a culture where art was more than decoration. The people who made them lived in small farming villages scattered across the plateau. Their homes were likely built of mud walls and thatched roofs, arranged around courtyards where cooking fires burned low and children played in the dust. The land here was fertile enough for growing millet, sorghum and cowpeas, and the surrounding hills provided iron-rich stone that could be smelted into tools and weapons. The iron is important. Long before many other parts of West Africa took up ironworking, the Nok people were already smelting ore in clay furnaces, their fires hot enough to turn stone into molten metal. From that metal came hoes for tilling the soil, arrowheads for hunting, and spears for defense. This technological skill, combined with their artistry in terracotta, marks them as one of the region's most remarkable early cultures. But you would not know any of this if not for an accident in the 1920s. Miners digging for tin in the village of Nok unearthed strange clay heads alongside their work. At first, they were curiosities, kept in local homes or sold as oddities. Only later did scholars realize they were pieces of an ancient civilization. By then, countless more had been found, some from mining sites, others from farmers' fields after the rains loosened the soil. The expressions on these faces are subtle. Some tilt slightly upward, as if looking toward the horizon. Others seem solemn, their lips pressed in quiet thought. Many wear elaborate hairstyles, rows of braids, or coiled buns captured in clay, with such care that individual strands can still be traced. Around some necks are carved collars or strings of beads. These details suggest not only artistic talent, but also the importance of personal adornment in Nok society. What they meant is harder to say. Were these sculptures portraits of real people, or idealized figures representing ancestors, leaders, or deities? Some are clearly male or female, but others are harder to classify. Their features a blend of both strength and softness. Some appear to be seated figures, others standing or kneeling. A few show signs of having once been painted, though time has stripped away the color. The clay used was fine-grained and carefully prepared, free of the larger pebbles and grit found in common pottery. It was shaped by hand, sometimes with the aid of wooden tools to smooth the surfaces or carve precise lines. Once formed, the figures were dried slowly to prevent cracking, then fired in open-air kilns or pit fires until they hardened. The process was slow, requiring steady heat and close attention, proof that these objects were valued enough to warrant the time. You imagine walking through a Nok village on a warm afternoon. The smell of cooking millet porridge drifts from an open hut. In the distance, a rhythmic clang of metal on metal comes from a smith shaping a new blade. In the shade of a tree, a potter leans over a half-finished sculpture, smoothing the curve of a cheek with wetted fingers. Chickens dart between huts, scattering as a child chases them, laughing. Somewhere, water is being drawn from a well, the rope creaking with each pull. Life here is not rushed. It follows the rhythm of the seasons, the planting rains, the harvest, the dry months when the harmattan winds sweep down from the Sahara, coating everything in a fine, pale dust. The faces in clay may have been made to mark these cycles, to honor the turning of the year or the memory of those who had passed. Or perhaps they were used in rituals we can only guess at, their presence lending weight to the spoken word or the shared silence of a gathering. Yet for all this detail, the Nok left no written record, and their descendants did not continue their exact traditions in ways we can easily trace. Over centuries, the villages were abandoned, and the sculptures were buried in the soil, waiting for miners and farmers to find them again. Many have been lost to looting, sold on the black market, to collectors who saw only art and not the story behind it. The fragments that remain in museums are often stripped of their original context, leaving archaeologists to piece together not just broken terracotta, but an entire vanished way of life. And so you are left holding the image of that first face, the one with the hollow eyes and the open mouth. It is not speaking. It has not spoken for over 2,000 years, but you cannot shake the feeling that it is looking at you, asking something you cannot quite put into words. What did these people see when they looked into the eyes of their own creations? The face in clay still lingers in your mind, but now your attention shifts to something far more forceful than terracotta, the glowing heart of a furnace. You are standing near the edge of a Noack village, where a mound of reddish-brown clay has been shaped into a domed structure taller than a person's waist. A small opening near the base breathes heat into the air, and inside, iron ore is turning from stone into something more useful. The sound here is steady, the low rush of air as two men work a pair of leather bellows, the rhythmic thump as they press and release, forcing oxygen into the furnace. The fire inside roars in answer, its heat so intense that you can feel it against your skin, even from several paces away. The smell is sharp, a mix of burning charcoal and the faint metallic temps of the ore itself. Ironworking is no simple matter. The ore has to be dug from the surrounding hills, carried back to the village, and broken into smaller pieces. Charcoal, made from carefully burned wood, must be prepared in advance. The furnace is heated slowly, then brought to a temperature high enough to loosen the metal from the rock. What emerges after hours of tending is a spongy mass of iron called a bloom, which will be hammered to drive out impurities. This is not the work of a single person, but of a community: the miners, the charcoal makers, the smelters, and the smiths all play their part. The iron they produce will be shaped into tools that make life here possible: hoes with flat, wide blades for turning the soil, sickles for cutting grain, and axes for felling trees. Hunting weapons, arrowheads, spear points are made as well, though in this season they are less in demand than the farming tools. The Noack are farmers before they are warriors. Step away from the furnace, and you find yourself among the fields. The land undulates gently, broken by the occasional cluster of trees that offer shade for workers in the midday heat. Here, millet grows tall and straight, its grain heads heavy. Sorghum waves in the breeze, its reddish seeds a sign of the coming harvest. Cowpeas crawl low to the ground, their pods ripening in the sun. Farming is a family affair. Men and women work side by side, sometimes joined by older children. The hoes bite into the earth with a steady rhythm, followed by the quiet patter of seeds dropped into furrows. The fields are not enormous, but they are enough to feed the village, with a little left over for trade. Back in the village, you notice the storage pits, round holes dug into the ground and lined with clay. Here, surplus grain is kept safe from rain and pests, covered with thatch and sealed with mud. A well-fed village can survive a bad season, and a village with a surplus can trade for what it cannot make itself. Trade here is quiet and local, but its reach is wider than you might think. Pottery from one settlement may appear in another miles away. Iron tools may be exchanged for salt or stone from regions farther off. Beads, those small, carefully drilled bits of stone or clay, may pass from hand to hand until they end up far from where they were made. You imagine market days when people from nearby villages gather under the shade of a large tree or an open clearing. Goods are laid out on mats, bundles of millet, clay pots, iron tools, carved wooden stools. Conversation hums, not hurried but steady, as transactions are made through barter. A hoe for a pot for a handful of dried fish, a string of beads for a bag of salt. News travels here too. Who has married? Who has moved to another village? Whether the rains have been good this year. In the spaces between the furnaces and the fields, life moves at its own pace. In one courtyard, a woman grinds millet on a flat stone, her movements practiced and unhurried. In another, a man repairs the roof of his hut, weaving fresh grass into the thatch. Children chase each other in games that leave their feet coated in dust, their laughter carrying over the hum of work. The terracotta figures you saw earlier begin to seem less like isolated works of art and more like part of this whole rhythm. They might have been made between planting and harvest, when there was time for work that did not feed the body but fed the spirit. They might have been part of ceremonies to bless the crops or to honor ancestors whose wisdom still guided the living. But for all the life here, there is also fragility. A bad season can thin the stores. A failed furnace can waste weeks of work. A shift in the weather can turn fields to dust or flood them beyond repair. The Noack are skilled, but they live close to the edge, just as all early farming societies do, and yet, standing here, you would not think about decline or disappearance. You would see only the glow of the furnace at night, the golden light of the harvest, and the patient faces of people who have shaped both earth and metal to their will. You would not know that one day the villages will be empty, the fields overgrown, and the clay figures buried under centuries of red soil, and you might wonder, as you watch a knocksmith lift his hammer to strike the iron bloom on the anvil, what it means for a civilization to master both the heat of the furnace and the quiet order of the fields, and still be forgotten. The village is still here, in your mind. The fields, the furnaces, the clay figures drying in the sun, but time has a way of shifting the ground beneath people's feet. Centuries pass, and the steady rhythm of Noak life begins to slow. There is no sudden storm, no invader's army sweeping over the hills, no grand monument toppled in defiance. Instead, it is the kind of fading that comes so quietly you would miss it if you stood too close. The climate begins to change. The rains do not come as predictably. Some years bring drought so deep that the millet heads stay small and tight, rattling in the wind. Other years, the rivers swell too quickly, flooding the low fields and leaving them coated in silt too thick for planting. The earth is still fertile in places, but it can no longer be relied upon in the same way. A village that once had grain to store must now eat its reserves before the next harvest. Trade, too, begins to thin. The tools from knock furnaces are still strong, the pottery still useful, but the networks that carried them to distant villages grow shorter. A route once used for exchanging salt or stone may be abandoned when the settlements along it are emptied. The reasons are never written down. Perhaps the people moved to find better land. Perhaps the wells dried, Perhaps disputes made certain paths too dangerous. The result is the same: fewer goods coming in, fewer leaving. The terracotta figures, once made with patient skill, become rarer. Fewer fragments appear in the soil of later settlements. Perhaps the tradition fades because the people who made them leave, or because their rituals change, or because survival demands that hands be used for the work of farming and smithing alone. Without a written language, their beliefs are carried only in memory, and memories can change or disappear when those who hold them move on. You can imagine the last years here: smaller harvests, fewer market days, the sound of furnaces working less often. Families decide to join relatives in other regions, carrying what they can: their tools, their animals, their knowledge of the land. The clay houses are left behind, their thatch roofs collapsing with the first seasons of rain. Slowly, the walls melt back into the soil. The fields grow over with grass and scrub. The paths that once connected villages are erased by time and weather. The terracotta figures are left where they stood, or are buried in the remains of houses and shrines. Rain and shifting soil cover them. For centuries they sleep in the red earth, until the 20th century uncovers them again, not through planned excavation, but through accident. Tin miners in the 1920s break into a layer of soil where a clay head rests. They lift it into the light for the first time in 2,000 years. Its eyes are still hollow, its mouth still open. It has not spoken, but it has endured in the decades that follow. More are found, some carefully excavated by archaeologists, others taken from the ground and sold before they can be studied. Many are scattered into private collections, stripped of their context, their story broken in half, without knowing exactly where they came from or how they were placed. The full meaning of the Nok sculptures remains out of reach. What remains is a puzzle with too many missing pieces. We know they farmed. We know they smelted iron earlier than most in their region. We know they shaped clay into human and animal forms with remarkable detail. But we do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what songs they sang at harvest, what stories they told children by the fire. And yet, the Nok are not entirely gone. Their descendants may still live in the region, their cultural threads woven into the tapestry of the many peoples of Nigeria. Skills in farming, pottery, and metalwork may have passed down in ways too subtle for archaeology to trace. The faces in clay may have echoes in local art forms centuries later. Standing in the present, holding one of those terracotta fragments, you might feel the weight of the unknown pressing as much as the artifact itself. The red dust clings to your fingers, the same dust that once settled on the feet of the people who made it. You look into the hollow eyes and wonder whether the last Nok villagers knew they were the last, or whether they simply moved on, carrying their lives forward, leaving the rest for the earth to keep. In the end, the Nok culture did not vanish in fire or flood, but in the quiet way of so many human stories, absorbed into others, changed beyond recognition, remembered only in fragments. And somewhere beneath your feet, still waiting, there may be another face, another pair of eyes, ready to look back across the centuries when the earth finally lets it go. Story 3: The Harlor, Kingdom and the Forgotten Stone Towns of Ethiopia. Begin your walk not in a bustling city, but in a landscape of quiet ruin. The Ethiopian sun hangs high overhead, pouring pale light over the broken outlines of stone walls. The stones are not scattered at random. They form the foundations of buildings, rectangular houses, narrow alleyways, and the remains of mosques. Some walls still rise, chest high, their stones laid so precisely that they have held their shape for centuries without the help of mortar. These are the towns of the Harlor, a people remembered in local tradition as the giants who built in stone when others built in earth. The label is not meant literally. It is a way of explaining how such finely cut and heavy stones could have been placed without the tools or cranes of later centuries. In truth, the Harlor were not giants, but they were skilled masons, traders, and farmers who once made this part of the Horn of Africa a center of life. The ruins lie in the arid plains east of the Ethiopian highlands, in a region that once connected the trade routes of the Red Sea coast to the fertile inland valleys. It is easy to imagine how these towns might have sounded in their prime, the calls of merchants in narrow markets, the bleating of goats herded through stone gates, the clink of metal tools against the rock as new walls rose. Standing here today, you see only the outlines. A low wall marks what might have been a courtyard. The base of a rectangular platform could have been the floor of a mosque oriented toward Mecca. Doorways still frame the horizon, their lintel stones weathered but unbroken. The streets are narrow, forcing you to step in single file as you pass. Between the remains of houses, the Harlor people did not leave written records in their own language. The only words we have come from later accounts, travelers and neighbors who spoke of them as skilled builders and traders. Their towns were not isolated. They were connected to a web of commerce that stretched across the Red Sea to Arabia, and up along the coast toward the trading ports of modern-day Somalia and Djibouti. Goods from far away, beads from India, glazed pottery from the Persian Gulf have been found in their ruins. It is likely that the Harlor were Muslim part of the wave of Islamic culture and trade that spread along the coasts of Africa after the 7th century. The mosques in their towns suggest not only faith, but the presence of teachers, scholars, and merchants who brought with them ideas as well as goods. A Harlor market might have held baskets of local grain alongside imported spices, camel loads of salt slabs from the Danakil Depression, and pottery painted in styles from far beyond the Horn of Africa. The land itself is harsh in places, with long dry seasons and short bursts of rain. Farming here required planning and persistence. The Harlor likely grew sorghum, barley, and millet in terraced plots, their walls holding back the soil on the slopes. They kept goats and cattle, moved seasonally to find pasture, and relied on stored grain to see them through the lean months. The surrounding acacia scrub provided firewood, though it was gathered carefully so as not to strip the land bare. To walk through a Harlor town in its time would have been to hear many languages, local Cushitic tongues, Arabic from the traders, perhaps even fragments of distant Indian or Persian words carried by sailors. A caravan arriving from the coast would bring the smell of salt and the creak of loaded camels. One leaving for the highlands would carry grain, hides, and woven cloth. Yet today, the people are gone. Only the stones remain, and the occasional bead or shard of pottery turned up by rain. Oral traditions among the Oromo and Somali peoples remember the Harlor as a lost people, sometimes said to have vanished overnight, sometimes said to have been cursed. Archaeology suggests a less sudden end, perhaps drought, perhaps conflict, perhaps the slow pull of people away from the stone. Towns toward newer centers of trade. Looking out across the ruins, you can feel the stillness pressing in. There is no movement except for the wind, no sound but the faint rattle of dry leaves against stone. And yet, if you close your eyes, You can almost hear footsteps on these streets. The clatter of goods in a stall, the voice of a mason calling for another stone to be lifted into place. It leaves you with a question as old as the ruins themselves. When a people vanish and leave no written record, do they truly disappear, or do they live on in the stones they shaped, the roads they walked, and the stories told by those who came after? The sun rises over the Harlor towns, not to silence, but to movement. In the cool light of morning, the narrow streets are already awake. A camel train has just arrived from the coast, its animals stepping carefully through the stone gateways, their shadows stretching long against the packed earth. Each carries a wooden frame, loaded with bundles, some wrapped in palm matting, others in thick leather. The air holds the scent of salt and dried fish, of spices packed tightly in jars. The merchants who lead the train are lean and dust-covered, their clothes faded from weeks of travel. They greet the townspeople in a mix of Arabic and local speech, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Deals begin almost immediately. Grain from the highlands is weighed in carved wooden measures, exchanged for bolts of cloth from Yemen or strings of glass beads from India. A small crowd gathers around one merchant's open chest, where glazed ceramics in green and brown shine in the early sun, a rare prize for those who can afford it. These streets are not grand boulevards. They are narrow paths, hemmed in by stone walls, sometimes so close that two men with loaded baskets must turn sideways to pass each other. But they are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The Harlor built for permanence, heavy stone foundations, thick walls, and rectangular layouts that give their towns a sense of order even in ruin. Beyond the market, you can hear the steady ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Metal is precious here, whether iron from local sources or copper and brass brought in from afar. Tools are shaped for farming, knives for trade, and sometimes blades for defense. The blacksmith's fire burns day after day, fueled by carefully gathered wood and charcoal. Food is traded alongside tools. Farmers from the surrounding countryside bring in sacks of sorghum, millet, and barley, carried on donkeys or balanced on their own shoulders. Women sell fresh milk in clay jars, still cool from the morning milking. Others sit behind baskets of onions, beans, and handfuls of fragrant herbs. The smells mix with the sharper scent of tanned hides hanging in strips from wooden poles, ready to be traded or fashioned into belts, sandals, or straps for camels. From the highlands come other goods, honey thick and golden, beeswax for making, candles, and even small quantities of gold panned from mountain streams. The highlands also send people, traders, pilgrims, and officials who pass through the Harlor towns on their way to the coast. Each arrival and departure adds to the flow of goods and news, linking this place to a network that reaches far beyond the horizon. The Harlor are not only receivers of trade, they are middlemen in a much larger system. From the Red Sea ports, ships bring goods from Arabia, Persia, and India. From the interior of Africa come ivory, hides, and incense. The Harlor towns sit between these worlds, taking their share of profit for every load that passes through. Salt slabs from the Danakil Depression move inland from here, each one heavy on the back of a camel. Spices and beads travel in the opposite direction, heading toward the ships that wait at the coast. Religion, too, moves along these roads. The Harlor's mosques are not large, but they are built with care. Their stone mihrabs facing Mecca. In the cool of the morning and the heat of the afternoon, the faithful gather to pray, the call to prayer carried by human voice rather than tower or bell. Religious teachers from Arabia may stop here for weeks or months, sharing both Islamic learning and stories from other lands. Outside the town walls, farming keeps the population fed. Terraced fields climb the lower slopes of the surrounding hills, their stone-retaining walls catching the thin soil and holding the moisture from seasonal rains. Farmers work with short-handled hoes, planting sorghum in neat rows. Goats and cattle graze in the scrubland, their herders watching from the shade of thorn trees. Water is precious, carried from wells or seasonal streams in clay jars. In good years, the grain stores are full. In poor years, the market becomes as much a place for bargaining over food as for the luxuries brought from far away. Life here is tied to the rhythm of trade and season. When the coastal winds change, ships arrive and caravans follow, and the markets are busy. When the dry months linger, the pace slows, and the town feels smaller. But even in the lean seasons, the Harlor keep their stone walls in repair, their gateways clear, their mosques standing. They build as if they expect their towns to last forever. From a distance, the sight of a Harlor town must have been striking. Low, square buildings of stone rising from the dusty plains, their pale walls catching the light. For a traveler arriving after days of journey through thorn, scrub, and dry riverbeds, the first glimpse of stone would be a promise of water, food, and rest. And yet, centuries later, these same walls will stand silent, their builders gone. The markets will be empty, the wells dry, the mosques roofless under the open sky. What could cause such a place so connected to the flow of trade, so carefully built to fade into ruin? Was it the shifting of trade routes toward other ports? Was it drought, famine, or conflict? Or did the Harlor simply blend into the peoples around them, leaving their towns to be claimed by the wind? For now, in this moment of their history, the Harlor towns are still alive. The salt caravans still arrive. The merchants still bargain in shaded courtyards. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer still carries down the narrow streets. And yet, if you stand at the edge of the market and look toward the far hills, you might wonder how long this road between seas will keep its stones. The Harlor towns do not fall in a single night. There is no great siege, no sudden fire, no story of conquest carved into the walls. Instead, their fading happens in the way that so many civilizations end, slowly, almost invisibly, as the flow of life thins until it disappears altogether. Trade is the first thread to loosen. The caravans that once brought salt from the Danakil and spices from the coast begin to take other routes. New ports rise along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, offering merchants faster or safer paths. Inland, new political powers emerge, redirecting goods and wealth toward other centers. The Harlor's place in the web of commerce begins to shrink, and with it, the prosperity that once kept their towns alive. Droughts come and go, but in some decades they are longer, harsher. Wells run low in the dry season, and even the terraced fields struggle to hold enough water for grain. Herds must be moved farther to find pasture, leaving the towns with fewer hands to work the walls and markets. Families begin to drift away, some toward the highlands, others toward the coast. The houses they leave behind are closed up at first, but over time their roofs collapse, and the wind scatters the dust inside. The mosques, once the center of community life, become quieter. Fewer voices answer the call to prayer. In some towns, the imam leaves to join relatives elsewhere, and without him, the congregation dwindles further. The blacksmith's hammer is heard less often. Markets meet on fewer days, and eventually, Only when a caravan happens to pass through, without enough people to maintain them, the stone walls begin to change. Plants root between the blocks, prying them apart as they grow. Rain, rare but sudden, pours down the streets and pools in the corners of abandoned courtyards. Slowly, the carefully laid stones lose their sharp edges. Roof beams rot, doorways crumble. The people who remain see the changes but cannot reverse them. Some towns hold on longer than others, sustained by a nearby well or a patch of fertile land. But one by one, they follow the same pattern. Fewer people, fewer goods, less reason to stay. In the end, the last families pack their belongings onto donkeys or camels and walk away, their footsteps joining the countless others that have already left. Centuries pass. The walls stand, but now they are silent. The wind moves through the empty streets, carrying only the rustle of dry leaves and the faint whistle of sand slipping through cracks in the stone. Occasionally, a traveler passes by and wonders who built such things in a land where most villages are made of mud and wood. Without a written record, the answer is left to memory, and memory turns to story. Among the Oromo and Somali peoples, tales grow about the Harlor. Some say they were giants, so large they could lift the stones by hand. Others say they were cursed. For their pride, their cities swallowed by the earth in a single night. Still others claim they left because they knew something terrible was coming, a famine, a plague, and they walked away before it reached them. None of the stories match exactly, but all agree on one thing. The Harlor were different from the people who came after, and their stone towns were unlike anything else in the region. In time, even the name Harlor becomes a shadow. The towns are reclaimed by thorn scrub, their stones sun-bleached and half-buried. The roads that once led to their gates are forgotten, covered by grass or washed away by seasonal floods. Travelers pass nearby without ever knowing that entire towns lie just beyond the rise of the hills. When archaeologists finally arrive, they find more questions than answers. The pottery beads and imported goods tell of a people tied to vast trade networks. The mosques show the spread of Islam deep into the interior. The terraces speak of skill in managing a difficult landscape. But the Harlor themselves are gone, their language and their voices lost. Standing among the ruins today, you can still feel the weight of their work. The stones fit together with precision, each one placed with care centuries ago. A doorway frames the horizon just as it did when merchants passed through it with their goods. A section of wall still casts the same shadow it did on hot afternoons when children played in its shelter. Everything is still here, and yet everything is gone, and you are left to wonder, did the last person to leave a Harlor town look back? Did they see the walls and think they would return one day? Or did they walk away knowing the stones would stand alone, holding their silence for centuries? Story 4. The Mocha farmers who painted their pots with everything they saw the first thing you notice is the light bright and sharp, falling over a landscape that seems, at first, too dry to grow anything. You are in northern Peru, nearly 2,000 years ago, where the desert stretches in pale sand and brown rock toward the Pacific Ocean. And yet, between the desert ridges, green valleys, wind inland, following rivers that bring life down from the distant Andes, it is here, in these ribbons of fertile land, that the Mocha people have built their homes. The villages are clusters of adobe houses, walls of sun-dried mud brick that glow warm in the sunlight. Their surfaces are smooth, sometimes painted, sometimes marked with handprints from the builders. The roofs are flat, made from reed mats laid over wooden beams, with ladders leading up so that the roof can be used as a workspace or a place to dry crops in the sun. Beyond the houses, the fields spread out in neat patterns. Canals carry water from the river into the dry ground, turning sand into farmland. The Mocha grow maize, beans, squash, and peanuts, along with cotton for weaving and gourds for making containers. The irrigation system is more than a convenience. It is survival. Without it, the desert would reclaim everything. The farmers work in the early light, before the heat of the day, their feet sinking slightly into the moist earth of the irrigated plots. Men and women both take part, bending to plant seeds or to weed around young plants. In the distance, the river glints in the sun, its water brown with silt from the highlands. But the Mocha are not only farmers. In the workshops of the village, potters turn clay into vessels of every shape. Some are simple jars for storing grain or chicha beer. Others are stirrup-spout bottles, their necks curved like a question mark, their handles looping over the top in a shape unique to this coast. These special vessels are made not just to hold liquid, but to hold images. This is the Mocha's way of telling stories. They have no written language, no carved stele covered in glyphs. Instead, they use the surface of a pot as a page. With fine brushes, they paint scenes from daily life. A fisherman paddling a reed boat, a farmer carrying maize, a child chasing a dog through the dust. They also paint rituals, priests wearing elaborate headdresses, warriors holding spears, dancers in animal masks. Some vessels are shaped into human heads, so lifelike that they seem to be portraits of real people, their expressions frozen in clay. In one corner of the village, you see a potter at work. The clay is fine and reddish-brown, kneaded until it is smooth. The vessel takes shape slowly, built by hand rather than on a wheel. Once the form is complete, the potter sets it aside to dry before painting it with slips of red, white, and black. The designs are precise, the lines steady. This pot will carry its images into the earth, perhaps as a gift in a grave, perhaps as an offering in a temple. Temples here are not carved from stone, but built from millions of adobe bricks, each one molded by hand. The largest rises above the valley floor in stepped layers, the Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun. From its summit, you can see the green fields, the desert beyond, and the shimmer of the Pacific to the west. Across the river stands its counterpart, the Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon. Its walls are painted with figures, warriors, priests, gods, with fanged mouths and staring eyes. The colors have faded in the sun, but in their time they would have been vivid against the mud brick. Life here is tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the flow of water. The river swells when the rains come in the Andes, feeding the canals and filling the fields. In those months, the work is constant, planting, weeding, tending the crops. When the harvest comes, there are feasts, music, and offerings to ensure the river will rise again next year. On some days, the fishermen leave early for the coast, their red boats, cabalitos, gitatora, little red horses, gliding over the waves. They bring back fish and shellfish, which are dried in the sun for storage or trade. The smell of the sea mixes with the smell of earth and clay in the markets where fish are exchanged for maize. Cotton and pottery dot everywhere. There is evidence of a people who observe their own lives closely enough to paint them in lasting detail. A jar might show a man planting beans, another might capture a game being played. Another might show a hunt for deer in the hills. Some scenes are peaceful, others violent. Some show mythic creatures, half human, half animal, suggesting stories that were told but never written down. Walking through the Mocha Valley, you feel that these people are speaking across time, not with words but with images, and that their painted pots are their voices. And you cannot help but wonder what it meant to live in a place where the everyday was worthy of recording, not just the triumphs of rulers, but the planting of a seed, the weaving of cloth, the paddling of a boat. And if the pots could speak, what more would they tell us about the lives that shaped them? The air inside the Huaca de la Luna is cooler than the sunlit plaza outside. The thick adobe walls rise around you, their surfaces layered with paint in red, white, and yellow. Figures march across them, warriors with clubs, priests in tall headdresses, a god with sharp fangs and staring eyes, his arms outstretched as if to claim everything beneath him. The paint is centuries old, yet still vivid in the shaded places. This is not only a temple, it is the stage on which the Mocha's most important rituals unfold. The same scenes painted on these walls appear on their pottery, each vessel carrying the imagery into homes, markets, and graves. The stories are repeated so often that they form a kind of visual language, recognizable to anyone who has seen enough pots, murals, or textiles. The Mocha do not write their myths in words, but they paint them with precision. You see them again and again, the priest wearing a crescent-shaped headdress, standing beside a platform where captives kneel. The priest holds a tall goblet, and into it blood is poured from a shallow bowl. Around him, attendants wear animal masks, birds, foxes, felines, their cloaks and headdresses swaying as they move. This is the sacrifice ceremony, one of the most repeated scenes in Mocha art. On the desert coast, water is life, and power belongs to those who can claim control over it. The Mocha elite, often priests as well, as rulers, may have used these ceremonies to demonstrate their connection to the gods, to show that the rivers rise and the crops growth depended on their ability to honor the forces beyond the human world. Sacrifices, whether of captured warriors or offerings of food and goods, were part of that exchange. The pottery preserves not just the ritual, but its setting. You can make out the stepped platforms, the lines of onlookers, the costumes worn by each participant. Some vessels are modeled in 3 dimensions. A priest in full regalia, a bound captive, a temple with its stairways and plazas. These are not vague symbols, they are careful observations. Whoever painted them wanted the details remembered. Outside the temples, the rhythm of daily life continues. Farmers tend the canals that keep the fields alive. Potters shape clay in shaded courtyards. Fishermen paddle out before dawn to set their nets. But all of these activities are tied, in the Mocha mind, to the rituals of the temple. If the ceremonies please the gods, the rains will come, the canals will run full, the harvest will be rich. The connection between the temples and the valleys is more than symbolic, it is physical. The same canals that watered the fields also carry clay for the potters, and the same harvests that feed the people provide the surplus that sustains the priests and artisans. Without water, the temples cannot be built, the pots cannot be made, the rituals cannot be held. The Mocha's attention to detail extends to their depictions of animals. On some pots, you see seabirds wheeling over waves, each feather picked out in fine lines. On others, deer leap across painted hillsides, their legs caught mid-stride. There are crabs, lobsters, owls, bats, and lizards, each rendered with enough accuracy that you could identify the species. The Mocha paint not just what they see, but how it moves. A crab's sideways scuttle, a bird's downward dive, a fox's cautious trot. And then there are the figures that are not quite real creatures, with the claws of a crab, the body of a man, and the fangs of a jaguar. Beings with human faces, but wings like a bird. Serpents with eyes that look directly at you. These may be the gods and spirits of Mocha belief, living in the same valleys and waters as the people, but on a different plane of existence. The pottery is not only for temples and rituals. Many vessels are placed in graves, sometimes alongside tools, weapons, or ornaments. These burials suggest a belief in an afterlife where such objects would be needed or valued. A stirrup spout bottle painted with a fisherman might accompany a man who spent his life at sea. A vessel shaped like a maize plant might be placed with a farmer. The art reflects not just the public life of the community, but the private identities of its members. In this way, the Mocha create a record of themselves that is more complete than many civilizations with written histories. We see their rituals, their tools, their animals, their clothing, their expressions. We see the serious and the playful warriors locked in combat, but also children playing games, priests in solemn ceremony, but also animals stealing food from kitchens. And yet, for all the detail, there is much we cannot know. We can watch the scenes unfold on clay, but we cannot hear the words spoken, the chants sung, the prayers offered. We cannot know exactly what the gods meant to them, or how they explained the cycles of drought and flood, sickness and health. The images are rich, but the meanings behind them remain partly hidden. Still, when you hold a Mocha pot in your hands, its surface smooth, its images clear, it feels as though someone across 2,000 years has reached out to show you what mattered to them. And you might wonder, if our lives were painted in clay, what scenes would we choose to last that long? The river still runs down from the Andes, brown with silt, but its path is shifting. Some years it comes later than expected. Some years it swells with such force that the canals burst, the fields flood, and the adobe walls of houses and temples slump into wet heaps. The Mocha have always lived between too much water and too little, but now the balance is changing in ways they cannot control. The weather itself turns erratic. Along the coast, the Pacific warms in cycles that bring violent El Niño storms, dumping heavy rain on the normally dry valleys. The rains wash away crops, rot stored grain, and send rivers rushing down from the mountains with destructive force. In other years, the opposite happens. The rains fail in the highlands, and the rivers shrink to sluggish streams, unable to feed the fields. The canals that were once the lifelines of the Mocha begin to silt up or run dry. Without steady water, harvests shrink. When the granaries are empty, the temples have less to give in offerings, and the ceremonies lose some of their power in the eyes of the people. The connection between the priests and the prosperity of the valley begins to fray. Trade. Routes shift as well. New powers rise in the Andes, the Wari to the south, other coastal cultures to the north, and the flow of goods changes direction. Where Mocha potters once sent their painted vessels far along the coast, now fewer leave the valleys. The stories they tell in clay become more local, less tied to a larger network. In times of scarcity, competition can turn to conflict. Some Mocha centers may have fought with others for control of the most fertile land and reliable water. The scenes on late Mocha pottery show more warriors, more bound captives, more weapons, perhaps a reflection of the growing tension in the valleys. The great temples still stand, but they are no longer built higher with each generation. Some are partially abandoned, their upper platforms crumbling, their painted walls fading under the sun and rain. The Huaca de la Luna, once alive with processions, begins to echo with emptiness in its upper chambers. The Huaca del Sol bears scars where heavy rains have cut into its sides. The people do not vanish all at once. Villagers continue to plant maize and beans, to fish from reed boats, to firepots in courtyard kilns. But the style of the pottery begins to change. The fine line paintings become less common, replaced by simpler designs. The stirrup spout bottles that once carried entire narratives shrink in number. In some valleys, they stop being made altogether. It may be that the Mocha culture, like the river, divided and flowed into new channels. Some groups may have moved inland toward the foothills, others north or south along the coast. In those new places, their traditions would have mixed with those of their neighbors, creating new styles of pottery, new ways of farming, new rituals. The Mocha themselves may not have thought of their culture as ending, only changing, but to us, looking back from centuries later, it feels like a fading. The painted scenes grow fewer until they stop entirely. The voices in clay fall silent. What remains are the vessels buried in graves, sealed in the dry earth, waiting to be uncovered. When archaeologists first lift a Mocha pot from the ground, its surface is often as clear as the day it was made. A warrior still holds his spear. A fisherman still casts his net. A priest still raises a goblet. The colors, protected from the sun, are as sharp as ever. For a moment, the gap of centuries feels smaller. But once the pot is removed from its burial place, the rest of its story, the voice that once explained its images, is gone forever. Walking through a Mocha site today, you might see the outlines of the old irrigation canals, now dry and partly filled with sand. You might stand in the shadow of a temple wall and imagine the ceremonies that once drew the whole valley together. You might look out across the desert and know that, somewhere beneath your feet, another painted pot waits in the earth, and you might wonder whether the last potter of the Mocha knew they were the last, or whether they shaped their vessel, painted their scene, and set it to dry in the sun without any thought that the long chain of hands before them would end with theirs. Story 5. The Sanxingdui. Bronze mask, makers of Sichuan. The air in the Sichuan basin is thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth and green leaves. You are standing not in the present-day farmlands of southwestern China, but in the territory of a culture so old that even its name has been borrowed from a modern village. The people who lived here more than 3,000 years ago did not call themselves the Sanxingdui, and they left no written record for us to borrow. What they did leave were faces, not in paint or clay, but in bronze and gold. The first of these faces comes from the earth suddenly. In 1929, when a farmer digging a ditch strikes something hard, it is not stone, but bronze, corroded green with age. More discoveries follow over the decades, but it is in the 1980s that the scale of the find becomes clear. Archaeologists uncover 2 massive pits filled with broken and burned objects, towering bronze masks with wide, staring eyes, human figures with elongated limbs, trees of bronze sprouting curling branches, and gold foil pressed into delicate patterns. The masks are unlike anything seen in other Chinese cultures of the time. Some are broad and flat, their ears large and flaring, their mouths small and pursed. Others have eyes that jut forward like tubes, as if meant to see farther than ordinary sight allows. One mask is covered in a sheet of hammered gold, its features still visible beneath the gleam. They are at once human and not faces of God's ancestors, or beings from a world beyond. In the centuries when these masks were made, much of the rest of China was under the influence of the Shang dynasty, known for its own bronze casting vessels, weapons, and ritual objects covered in swirling patterns. But the Sanxingdui style is different. Here, the focus is on the human face, exaggerated to a form that feels almost otherworldly. Bronze casting is no simple task. It requires mining copper and tin, smelting them to the right proportions, and pouring the molten metal into clay molds. The scale of the Sanxingdui bronzes, some masks over a meter wide, means their makers had both the skill and the resources to work on a monumental scale. The precision of the casting, even in fine details like eyebrows and hairlines, suggests a community of highly trained artisans. The pits in which these treasures were found are not burial sites in the usual sense. They contain no human remains, no arranged skeletons. Instead, they are filled with objects that were deliberately broken, burned, and then buried. Jade blades lie in fragments. Ivory tusks are piled alongside smashed vessels. The bronzes themselves show signs of having been damaged before being placed in the ground. Why would a culture pour such wealth and labor into making these objects, only to destroy and bury them? Some scholars think these were ritual offerings, a way to retire sacred objects after they had served their purpose, returning them to the earth. Others suggest that the pits may mark the end of the Sanxingdui culture itself. The remains of temples dismantled in haste before the people moved away or were conquered. The site lies near the banks of the Minjiang River, a tributary of the Yangtze, in a fertile basin ringed by mountains. The river would have been the lifeline for farming, trade, and communication. The people here grew millet, rice, and wheat, kept pigs and cattle, and likely traded along routes that stretched deep into China and perhaps beyond. The ivory in the pits hints at connections with distant lands, while the style of the bronzes hints at influences both local and unique. Standing in their workshops, you might have seen the Sanxingdui artisans at work, the heat of the furnaces, the smell of molten metal, the clatter of tools as molds were shaped and decorated. The clay for the molds would be packed carefully around wax or carved forms, dried, and then used to shape the flow of bronze into the precise curves of an ear, the arch of a brow, the flare of a nostril. When the mold was broken away, the gleaming face beneath would have looked almost alive. These were not casual works of art. They were the products of a culture that invested enormous energy into objects whose meaning we can only guess. And when they were buried, thousands of pieces together, the act must have been as deliberate as their making. Today, the masks stare back at us from museum displays, their expressions frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking. We can see their shape and surface, but not the thoughts that made them. Were they the faces of gods who watched over the fields and rivers? Were they ancestors, remembered in metal so they could never be forgotten? Or were they something stranger, a vision of beings the Sanxingdui believed they had seen or dreamed? As you look into those protruding eyes, you are left with the feeling that whatever they were meant to see, it was not just the world in front of them. The Sichuan Basin is a bowl of green. From the mountains, rivers flow down into the fertile plain, where the air is heavy with moisture and the soil is dark and rich. It is here that the Sanxingdui people built their settlements, clustering their houses near the Minjiang River and its smaller tributaries. From the riverbanks, the land opens into a patchwork of fields, orchards, and low wetlands where reeds sway in the breeze. Farming is the pulse of daily life. In the spring, the fields are turned and planted with millet and rice. Millet grows in the higher, drier plots, its stalks rising tall and golden as summer deepens. Rice grows in the flooded paddies, the water reflecting the sky in bright patches between the rows. Wheat, introduced from far to the west, is planted in cooler months, offering a third staple to the table. The work is steady and shared, men and women moving in lines across the fields, tools flashing in the light as they break the soil and pull weeds. The diet here is rich compared to many parts of ancient China. The rivers and ponds are full of fish, eels, and freshwater crabs. The forests at the basin's edges provide deer, boar, and wild fowl. Pigs, cattle, and dogs are kept in the settlements. The variety of foods means that the Sanxingdui people can support more than just farmers. There is room for specialists, artisans, and leaders who do not work the fields directly. Bronze casting is one of the great specializations. Workshops are built close to both clay sources and fuel supplies. Inside, the heat of the furnaces is constant. Teams of workers mine and transport copper and tin from deposits in the surrounding mountains, breaking the ore into manageable pieces. Charcoal burners keep the furnaces fed with steady fuel, their fires hot enough to melt the metal to a glowing liquid. The molds for the bronzes are made in stages. Fine clay is shaped into the desired form, a mask, a figure, a vessel, and then covered with an outer mold that can be removed and reassembled. Patterns are carved into the mold itself, so that when the bronze is poured and the mold broken away, the details appear in the finished piece. For the largest works, the molds must be made in sections and fitted together like a puzzle. The scale of some Sanxingdui bronzes suggests large, organized teams and a reliable supply of materials. This, in turn, hints at strong leadership. Perhaps rulers or high-ranking priests who directed resources and labor for religious or political purposes. The same organization that managed the fields and canals could have been used to manage the mines, the furnaces, and the workshops. Trade connects the Sanxingdui to the wider world. The ivory tusks found in the pits suggest long-distance exchange. Elephants were not native to the Sichuan basin in large numbers, so the tusks likely came from farther south or west. Jade objects, prized for their beauty and durability, may have come from distant mountains. Seashells found in the archaeological layers point to contact with coastal regions, hundreds of kilometers away. The river is the natural highway for this trade. Flat-bottomed boats, carved from single logs or built with planks, carry goods up and downstream. On land, goods move along packed earth roads, with porters carrying loads on poles across their shoulders and pack animals hauling heavier cargo. It is easy to imagine the marketplace in a Sanxingdui town. Farmers bring baskets of grain, vegetables, and fruit. Fishmongers sell fresh catches in woven traps. Potters offer plain cooking jars and fine painted vessels. A bronze worker might display smaller items, knives, ornaments, bells, while the grand ritual masks and statues remain in temples or the hands of the elite. Traders from beyond the basin arrive with jade, ivory, and rare woods, leaving with foodstuffs, textiles, and perhaps smaller bronze works, religion is woven into all of this. The great bronzes, with their wide eyes and deliberate expressions, are not everyday items. They are linked to ceremonies that bring together farming, trade, and political power. The same hands that plant rice in the spring might also help build the platforms for rituals, or carry offerings to the pits where sacred objects are buried. The Sanxingdui's art reflects their environment. Some bronzes feature tree-like forms, their branches curling and sprouting leaves or fruit, perhaps inspired by the local vegetation, perhaps by a sacred tree in their mythology. Animal motifs appear too: birds with long beaks, fish with curling fins, and dragons with flowing bodies. These are the same creatures that live in or around the basin, transformed into symbols and woven into a spiritual world. In this way, the Sanxingdui world is both practical and ceremonial. The canals and fields feed the people, the workshops and trade routes bring wealth and prestige, and above it all, the temples and ritual spaces transform the products of the land into offerings for forces unseen. Yet for all this complexity, their story still ends in silence. The pits of broken bronzes remind us that even the most organized, resourceful cultures can leave us with questions, and you cannot help but wonder what could have driven them to take so much of their wealth, destroy it, and bury it all at once. The Sanxingdui world does not end with the roar of war or the sudden collapse of walls. There is no record of an invading army, no layer of burned buildings in the soil. What happens instead is more difficult to see, the kind of change that creeps in over decades until the life that once filled the basin is gone. The pits of bronzes, jades, and ivory are one of the last things the Sanxingdui leave behind. They are deliberate objects carefully placed, often broken or burned first. A mask might have been struck to dent it, a jade blade snapped in two. Some pieces are charred, as though they had been through fire before being buried. This was no careless disposal, it was an act with meaning. One final ritual before the objects were taken out of use forever. Theories about why they did this are many. Perhaps the people were moving away to another part of the basin or into the mountains, and could not take these massive, sacred bronzes with them. Perhaps they were ending a cycle of worship, closing one chapter of their religion and beginning another elsewhere. Or perhaps something had happened, a disaster, a crisis, that made them decide these objects no longer belonged in the open world. Environmental change is one possibility. Rivers shift their courses in the Sichuan basin just as they do elsewhere. If the Minjiang or its tributaries moved away from the Sanxingdui heartland, farmland could have been stranded without irrigation. Flooding, too, might have scoured fields and swept away settlements. A series of poor harvests could have broken the delicate balance between farming, trade, and the large labor forces needed for bronze production. Another possibility is political change. The Sanxingdui may have been one center of power among several in the region. Over time, power may have shifted toward other settlements, perhaps toward Jinsha, another site not far away, where similar bronzes have been found. If leaders and artisans relocated, the old city could have slowly emptied, its temples and workshops falling silent. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The streets and courtyards grow quiet. The furnaces in the workshops go cold. The molds for casting are left unused, then crumble back into the soil. Houses, once patched and repaired every season, begin to sag under the weight of rain. Weeds root in the cracks between paving stones. The voices that once filled the markets and ceremonial plazas fade into the sound of wind moving through the reeds by the river. The Sanxingdui do not take their story with them in a form we can read. Without writing, their beliefs, their names, and their reasons for leaving survive only in the objects they left behind. And the objects are silent except for the shapes and patterns they carry. The wide eyes, the curling trees, the animal forms, the delicate gold leaf pressed over bronze. Centuries later, when all trace of their settlements is buried, the land above returns to farming. The river keeps flowing. New cultures rise and fall in the basin. The people who live here may have distant blood ties to the Sanxingdui, but the memory of the bronze mask makers is gone from their stories. It is not until the 20th century that the earth gives them back. Farmers digging in the fields bring up a fragment of a mask, its eyes still staring. Archaeologists uncover the pits and realize the scale of what has been buried, not 1 or 2 bronzes, but hundreds of pieces. The work of generations. The discovery reshapes what was known about ancient China, showing that a civilization of extraordinary skill and style thrived far from the Shang heartland. Yet the mystery remains. Why did they vanish? Why did they bury their treasures? Every theory fits part of the puzzle, but none explain it completely. The pits hold beauty, craftsmanship, and wealth, but they hold no answers. Standing before one of the masks today, in the clean light of a museum, you might find yourself wondering whether its makers knew it would be the last of its kind. Did they see the end coming, or did they believe they were simply moving on, leaving behind offerings for the gods to guard in their absence? Whatever they believed, the result is the same. The Sanxingdui are gone, their cities empty, their names forgotten. Only the faces remain, looking out with eyes wide enough to see across 3,000 years and still giving nothing away. Story 6. The Axumite Empire and their inscribed stone pillars. The Ethiopian highlands rise in layers, ridges of rock, green valleys, and distant peaks fading into the haze. The air is thin and sharp here. The mornings cool before the sun climbs. High. In the 4th century CE, you would see not just the mountains and fields, but a city that is the heart of an empire. Axum, from the outskirts. The first thing to catch your eye would not be the houses or markets, but the pillars, tall, slender, steely of carved stone, some more than 20 meters high. They stand in neat rows, their faces etched with patterns that mimic wooden buildings, false doors, windows, and beams, all chiseled into solid granite. Some are crowned with tops like the ends of logs. A few lie fallen and broken, their great weight having pulled them down centuries ago. Others still stand, balanced on their foundations, as they have for more than 1,000 years. These steely mark the graves of kings and nobles, though the tombs lie underground, hidden beneath the grassy field. The stones are not rough monuments. They are precision work, each line carved straight, each corner sharp. Moving one into place would require not only engineering skill, but the labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of workers. The city around them is alive with the sound of trade. Axum's streets are lined with merchants selling goods brought in from across the empire and beyond. Ivory from the African interior, gold from the rivers of Sudan, frankincense and myrrh from the lowlands, glassware and wine from the Mediterranean, textiles and spices from India. The markets smell of roasting grain, of incense smoke curling from clay burners, of fresh cut wood from the carpenter's stalls. This is a kingdom built on trade. its power drawn from its control of the routes between the interior of Africa and the ports of the Red Sea. The port of Agilis, far below on the coast, is crowded with ships, some from Arabia, others from as far as the Roman Empire and India. The goods unloaded there are carried inland by caravan, winding up through the highlands to Axum. In the other direction, ivory, gold, and other African goods flow down to the sea, bound for markets across the known world. In the royal quarter, palaces rise above the rest of the city, their walls of stone fitted without mortar, their interiors divided into courtyards, reception halls, and storerooms. Axum's kings rule as both political and spiritual leaders, their authority reinforced by displays of wealth and the building of monuments. Coins minted in gold, silver, and bronze bear their names and faces, along with inscriptions in Gayyads, the written language of the kingdom. These coins are among the first in the world to bear the symbol of the cross after the kingdom adopts Christianity in the early 4th century under King Azana. The Axumites are skilled farmers as well as traders. Terraced fields cling to the slopes around the city, holding the soil against erosion and capturing the rain that falls in the summer months. Wheat, barley, and teff, the grain used to make the flatbread injera, grow in neat rows. Cattle graze in the valleys, goats wander in small herds, and bees are kept for their honey. The inscribed pillars, however, are what visitors remember most. Some are covered in text recording the victories of kings' campaigns against neighboring peoples, the expansion of territory, the dedication of temples. Others are purely symbolic, their height and detail proclaiming the status of those they commemorate. The inscriptions, carved in sharp, precise letters, are written in Gaze and sometimes in Greek, reflecting Axum's role as an international power. Walking among them, you can feel the ambition they represent. Each stone began as a block cut from the quarries outside the city, hauled on wooden sledges and rolled on logs to the site. Workers with chisels and hammers shaped them into smooth shafts, then spent weeks or months carving the designs into their faces. Raising them into position was a feat of coordination. Ropes and ramps pulling the weight upright until it balanced on its base. The people of Axum live with these monuments in their skyline. Every day, they are part of festivals and ceremonies, silent witnesses to oaths, treaties, and the burial of rulers. They stand as symbols of the kingdom's wealth and its place in the world. A message to visitors that Axum is a place of permanence and power. And yet, for all their grandeur, the stelae also raise questions. Why this form, imitating wooden architecture in stone? Why so much effort for monuments that would stand over graves, often hidden from view after the burial? Perhaps the answer lies in what Axum's kings valued most: the display of authority not just for their own people, but for the traders' envoys and rivals who came to the city. Axum was a place where power was meant to be seen. As you stand at the base of one of these towering pillars, the carved windows stacked high above you, you might wonder how many kings walked here before you, how many caravans arrived with their goods, how many voices spoke the names now worn away by the wind. And you might ask yourself, if the pillars outlast the kingdom, will they still tell the story their builders meant them to tell? The morning sun spreads across the highland city, casting long shadows from the stone pillars. Down in the markets, traders are already arranging their goods, while far away, the first caravans of the day are winding up the road from the coast. Axum, at its height, is not just a city. It is the hub of a network that stretches in all directions, binding together Africa, Arabia, and the wider world. The lifeline to the sea runs through the port of Axum. On its quays, ships rock in the tidal swells, their hulls heavy with goods. Some are sawn-plank vessels from Arabia, others large wooden ships from Egypt, even a few heavier craft from India. Sailors and dock workers shout in a mix of tongues, loading and unloading under the glare of the coastal sun. From the decks come bales of cotton, jars of wine, sacks of grain, and bolts of silk. From the warehouses come tusks of ivory, bundles of hides, ingots of gold, and fragrant blocks of frankincense and myrrh, their scent carrying on the air. The road from Agalis to Axum is a path of wealth. It climbs from the sea through dry coastal plains, over hot escarpments, and into the cooler highlands. Along it move long strings of camels, their padded feet quiet on the dust. Donkeys carry smaller loads, bells tinkling as they climb. Armed guards march alongside, a reminder that not all who see a loaded caravan wish it well in the other direction. The road carries Axumite goods to the world beyond. The ivory of the African interior is prized in Rome and India for carving into luxury goods. Gold coins, stamped with the king's face, pay for spices from the Malabar coast, glassware from Alexandria, and fine cloth from the markets of the Mediterranean. Axum's control of this route gives it leverage over to continents, and the kings know it. King Azana, who rules in the early 4th century, understands the power of both trade and faith. Under his reign, Axum adopts Christianity, making it one of the first states in the world to do so officially. Missionaries from the Roman Empire arrive, churches rise alongside the older temples, and the cross appears on Axumite coins. The inscriptions carved on stele and stone tablets now sometimes mention the Christian God alongside traditional forms in the highland farms. The terraces are heavy with grain. Fields of teff ripple in the wind, its fine seeds destined to be ground into flour for injera. Wheat and barley grow on higher slopes, where the nights are cooler. Orchards of fig and olive trees, the valleys, their fruit a welcome addition to the diet. Beekeepers tend hives made from hollow logs, harvesting honey for food, drink, and trade beyond the farms. Herders move cattle and goats across the hills, their animals feeding on the grasses that sprout after the rains. In the dry season, the herds are led to the river valleys where water still flows. Meat and milk are part of the diet, but more often the animals are a store of wealth, exchanged. In marriage, tribute, or trade, the city's stone buildings are busy places. In the workshops, masons shape granite for new construction, while goldsmiths work in the finer quarters, their tools tapping delicately at the edges of coins, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. Weavers sit at looms, their shuttle threads flashing back and forth. Potters turn clay jars for storing grain, wine, and oil. Religion shapes the public life of the city. Christian churches rise, their interiors lit by oil lamps, their altars draped in fine cloth. But older traditions do not vanish overnight. Some of the pillars and tombs still honor the ancestors in the old way, and in the countryside, rituals tied to the seasons and the harvest continue much as before. The kingdom's strength lies in its ability to balance these influences, blending new beliefs with old customs in a way that keeps the loyalty of both city and countryside. Foreign visitors are common. Envoys from Arabia, merchants from India, and occasional Roman officials come to Axum to negotiate treaties, secure trade privileges, or simply see the power that lies in the highlands. For these guests, the towering stelae are more than monuments. They are statements. They declare that Axum is a place of permanence, of wealth carved in stone. The coins that change hands in the market carry the same message. Struck in gold, silver, and bronze, they bear the king's image and profile, with inscriptions in Gezi and sometimes in Greek. Their weight is reliable, their metal pure. In distant markets, a coin from Axum is recognized and trusted, a small disc of gold carrying the reputation of an entire empire. As the day ends, the city's markets begin to quiet. The sun dips behind the high hills, and the long shadows of the pillars stretch again across the grass. The caravans on the road will arrive tomorrow, and the cycle of trade will begin again. In this moment, Axum is at its height, its roads alive, its ships busy, its kings known from the Nile to the Indian Ocean. And yet, even as the pillars stand firm, the forces that will one day weaken the kingdom are already moving far beyond its borders. The pillars still stand in the field, their carved windows and doors catching the morning light, but the sounds that once filled Axum streets have grown thin. The markets are smaller now. Some stalls stand empty. The caravans from the coast still arrive, but not as often, and the goods they carry are fewer. The change begins far from the highlands. Across the Red Sea, in Arabia, new powers rise and shift the control of ports and sea lanes. The great trading world that once linked Rome, India, and Africa is itself changing. Rome has fallen in the west, and with it some of the demand for African ivory and gold. To the north, the Persian Empire and later Arab forces contest control of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, altering the flow of ships. Axum's port at Agilis suffers first. Foreign merchants begin favoring other harbors, some closer to the main sea routes, others under the control of new allies. The caravans that do still climb to Axum bring more necessities than luxuries. Ships still sail, but their cargoes are smaller, their visits less frequent. In the highlands, the fields remain fertile, but the wealth that once came from controlling trade begins to slip away. Without the steady stream of gold and silver from overseas markets, the minting of coins slows. The golden coins that once traveled across seas become rarer, replaced by smaller issues in bronze. Even the inscriptions change. The proud, bilingual legends of the peak years are replaced by simpler ones. The Christian faith remains strong, but the kingdom's ability to project power outward weakens. Beyond the hills, other peoples rise. In the lowlands, in the mountains to the north, and along the coasts, control over the long caravan routes becomes harder to maintain. Drought may have played a role too. Periods of unreliable rainfall make harvests less predictable, stressing the system that keeps both city and countryside fed. With less surplus, the ability to support armies, large building projects, and distant trade all declines. The city itself does not fall in flames. There is no single year when Axum ends. Instead, its decline is gradual. A merchant moves his business to another market. A caravan leader chooses a safer route. A skilled mason leaves for work in a different town. Bit by bit, the great web that tied Axum to the outside world frays until only the local threads remain. The pillars, however, do not leave. They remain in the grass fields, even as the palaces around them fall into ruin. Roof beams rot, walls tumble, and markets fade, but the steely stand through it all. Travelers passing through in later centuries see them and wonder who could have built such towering stones in a place so quiet. Stories grow of giants who lived here, of kings who commanded armies of slaves to carve the rock. of treasures buried beneath the pillars. Christianity endures in the highlands, carried by communities who trace their faith back to the days of King Azana. Churches rise near the ruins, some built from stones taken from older buildings, others new but echoing ancient forms. The written language of Gag survives as the liturgical language of the church, even after it ceases to be spoken in daily life. By the time European travelers hear of Axum in the early modern period, the city is no longer an imperial capital, but a place of pilgrimage, a town whose glory is in the past, but whose stones still draw the curious. The great stele leans slightly now, some cracked by centuries of wind and rain, but they still catch the light in the mornings, just as they did in the age of caravans. And that is perhaps the most enduring part of Axum's story, that the stone pillars outlast the empire they were meant to honor. They remain long after the king's names are forgotten, after the trade routes have shifted, after the gold coins have stopped. If you stand at their base today, looking up at the carved windows stacked into the sky, you might try to imagine the noise of the market, the clatter of hooves from arriving caravans, the sound of ships being unloaded in a port far below. But the only sound you will hear is the wind moving across the highland grass, carrying with it the memory of a kingdom that once stood above the Red Sea, watching the world come to its gates.